Friends, thinking about the year that has passed, there I guess is so much to say, to express the challenge. As Antoinette pointed out when she went through the Q&A responses, in the meeting, Stan Verrier asked a very moving question, or at least it was moving for me, listening. He said, well, how did COVID and the lockdowns and so on affect you and Bevan? And I was caught off guard. You know, one is used to answering technical questions in the Q&A, either of a financial nature or perhaps something that is in the reports or so on. And when you asked about, you know, how we coped, that took us to another level. And it was a very caring thing to ask, and I'm so pleased because it made me pause to think. And I'm sure our experience is mirrored in your experience, and perhaps you could even add other emotions to it. But part of it was disorientation. You know, both of us, Bevan and I, and the church office staff are trained in a way to do church in a certain model. We are used to a Sunday service. We prepare for it. We know how to do that, from the screen to the choice of hymns to the preparing of a sermon. And even the preparing of a sermon is a dialogical thing. You may not say much, but we look at you and you look at us and you respond in your facial gestures, in your body language. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you don't. And sometimes we can ask a question and there's a response. Even if there's no words, there's at least a murmur or a sound. Now to preach a sermon to a camera, that is a different thing indeed. Having never really done it before, we did little things like record missional habits and so on, but those were not sermons. You know, those were presentations. We knew what we were going to say, and we said it to the camera. It was recorded and sent out. So disorientation, I guess, was the number one thing on the list, confusion, and then I guess later on a low-grade sense of depression, of sadness. Firstly, sadness that having lived our lives, for me, 48 years, without a break in the regular, what we call the diet of worship. Every Sunday we have church, through Easter and Christmas, and we go on that train which C.S. Lewis, the term C.S. Lewis uses to describe the Christian year. It goes around, stops at the stations, Easter, Ascension, Pentecost, comes around, preaching the lectionary, and that is now removed. So it is a disorientating experience. There is a sadness. I think the greatest sadness, though, was the inability to make contact, physical contact with people. There's something that happens on a Sunday morning when we greet one another. There's something that happens when we can sit across the room from one another and share those transitions of life, whether it's preparing for a wedding or a funeral, or there's been bad news health-wise. There's something that happens there, and to be prohibited from doing that was very hard. And finally, perhaps the hardest of all, the thought that someone might have to die without us being able to be present. We do our best work at the bedsides of people who are passing on, and we are able to testify to the resurrection. Now, when we couldn't do that, that was the hardest and the bitterest pill to swallow. But as I mentioned at the Q&A, we've had some interesting experiences. A couple of weeks ago, I was able to visit with Marge Constant, our oldest member, and her daughter arranged it, and I went off to Funke, to the support center, and well, I was doused with hand sanitizer from head to toe. I even had to stand in a dip, like the old foot and mouth thing, and dressed in plastic, a hairnet on my head. I was surprised she even recognized me when she saw me. I was so covered in PPEs. But when she saw me, she started running with her arms open. And of course the nurses were shouting, "Stop, stop, stop." And I said, "Marge, if you hug me, this woman is going to beat me." But the excitement to simply have contact. And when later that day Sasha and I were talking about it, Sasha made the point that perhaps we look after people physically in situations like that, but we don't really know how to look after them spiritually and emotionally. You know, the lack of contact might do more damage. Marge said to the nurse, "I am over 100 years old. If I die tomorrow, hallelujah." And I said, "Praise the Lord." It was a beautiful and a moving experience, but it brought to a head what we had been feeling, Bevan and I, over all these months, and I'm sure you can identify with that. So thank you, Stan, for asking the question, and thank you for the journey that has come after that question to tonight. Antoinette has pointed out some of the lovely things that have happened. We were able to sustain ourselves when many of my colleagues were communicating deep trouble financially in congregations. Many members who are used to and have all their lives put money in the offering box in the church service, when that offering box was no longer possible during the strict lockdown and no services, they had the generosity of spirit to change their cash offering into EFTs. Shannon Wagstaff, who's our bookkeeper, who's the only one really who looks through the bank statement, can testify to that. People made the transition, and that in itself is an act of kindness and thinking beyond, you know, the ordinary into the situation the church might have found itself in. One of my colleagues in the Congregational Church, when we had a meeting soon after lockdown ended here at the church, an ecumenical meeting, we went around the room and many of the delegates told about what was happening in their churches, and he said, "We have had a terrible realization." And of course we were hanging on his every word to hear what the realization was. And then he said, "It seems to us that many of our members pay for goods and services." And what he meant by that was, when the church service was no longer allowed, when pastoral visiting was prohibited, many members, in his opinion, decided that since the goods and services of the church were not available, there was nothing to pay for. And so ministers' pensions and medical aids and things like that were not paid, and the denominations had to step in to help where they could. But of course, they themselves only had limited resources. And Annette has also pointed out some of the lovely things, that despite the fact that we have ended with a very small surplus, we must also take into account the tremendous blessing that the Kids Zone is to us. We have received an asset far beyond what we once had. The insurance company has been generous, has been fair in what they have done. What we asked for in terms of modernization, they only said yes to, never no. And so what we ended up with in the end is a modern version of what we had, and we're grateful for that. We don't take it for granted. And when we started the process with insurance, when we sat down with the assessor and the builders and everything, I said to them, "You must understand here that you're dealing with a church. We will not ask for anything that we do not deserve, but what we would like in return is fairness from you. You need to play straight with us. No funny business." And the assessor nodded his head, and so did the builder, and our experience right the way through was that they were straight. We had some horror stories from our neighbors, particularly the Methodist Church down the road, about insurance claims being declined and things like that. That was not our experience, and we give thanks to God for that, and we have thanked people appropriately, including the builder and the assessor at the end of the process. In addition to that, the council took advantage of the buildings being closed to do some routine maintenance that had been planned for a long time, but we never kind of found the gap to do it. And so we were able to replace some of the wooden windows in the office and all of the wooden windows at Bethuel's house that were looking in very bad repair and that would have cost us money in years to come. We put aluminium windows in, and we found a company through one of our members' suggestion that was fair with us and charged a reasonable rate, and we were able to clear up some of that. And as Antoinette has also pointed out, the electrical compliance, 60,000 Rand, which was funds raised after the fire, has been spent to make the rest of this complex compliant, hopefully setting us up for years to come. This piano, through the generosity of a kind donor in this church who wanted to remain nameless, at least anonymous, but also wanted to pay the bill himself and not put it through the books of the church, as a kind gesture, 25,000 Rands worth of refurbishment to this piano took place. And as Antoinette pointed out, 78,000 Rand. I mean, I could never have imagined when we started asking for money to help people in the Helderberg area who needed food. Schools, preschools, drop-in centers, night shelters and so on. Even our own pantry parcels. I could never have imagined that people would have responded over and above their tithes with 78,000 Rand. That is just the work of God, and there can be no doubt about it. Moving God's people to share what we have with others. God has been so good. And finally, the staff of this congregation have gone above and beyond the call of duty, doing things and finding new roles that are nowhere in their job descriptions, as we've had to adjust ourselves to a COVID world. Stephen and Romario in the front, Shannon in the books, Matthew for the youth, Neray, Bevan, myself, Bethuel, Agnes, all of us trying our best to work out how we do church in a COVID and hopefully a post-COVID world. I want to point out just a few short things for you, and we're going to put them on the screen. I want to go back to the last time I had an opportunity to have a vision speech. And Anthony, if you could just put on the next slide. I don't know if you remember, but if we go back to the last one, I played a little clip from a movie, Tom Hanks in the lead role, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. If you have not seen the movie, please do yourself a favor and watch it. It is one of the most beautiful commercial films that I've ever seen. And it tells the story of a Presbyterian minister, Fred Rogers, who in the 1960s, when television was getting started in America, decided that instead of taking a congregation after he graduated, he would rather offer to do a daytime children's TV show. Now, the time was right, and of course the Lord knew this, because at that time, the American TV stations were looking for material. They didn't have enough. They couldn't buy from anywhere else in the world. TV was just starting out in America. So they were desperate for material. So they took a chance on Fred Rogers. And they said to him, okay, you can put it on for a while, but we're going to look at the ratings. And if nobody's watching your TV show, we're going to take it off. Well, what that began was a very simple little TV show. In fact, if you look on the DSTV channels, the children's channels, sometimes you will find those episodes from A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Fred Rogers did a simple little show with puppets. He had a train that went around the room, scale-electric sort of a train, and he had some guests that dropped in, the mailman, the milkman, and so on. But he taught children how to process grief. He taught children how to process all the difficult things in the world, divorce, violence, things that were happening around them. But he also taught them, above all, to be a good neighbor. That's what he wanted to teach them. Well, that show, which really, if you think about it, was likely to be cancelled in no time at all, went on for 40 years. And Fred Rogers, instead of preaching every Sunday to a congregation, preached every day to a huge audience as the show was syndicated around the United States, and he influenced a generation of young people who grew up, many of whom decided to be a good neighbor. And when I heard that story, I thought to myself, can you imagine if spreading the gospel, if sharing one's faith could be as simple as this? What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And for me, that greatest commandment took on a new life altogether. And I thought, if only we could do that one thing, we could change the world. Because loving one's neighbor is sharing the good news of Jesus. That's what it is. Sharing the good news of Jesus is loving one's neighbor, and loving one's neighbor is sharing the good news of Jesus. But if I take out of my experience with new worshiping communities and reaching people who don't really want to come to church anymore, an image, I want to take out the image of the table tonight. You put it on the next slide there. Now, this particular story that you see illustrated there is a story of a woman, and I've played this clip before, who decided to put her picnic table that she bought in the front garden instead of the back. Her name is Kirsten Schnell, and she is on a mission to love her neighbors. We're going to play the video clip in a moment, but just to remember that just to tell you that this turquoise table movement has taken off throughout the United States, and there are hundreds of people around that country, and I guess there's some around the world who've seen the story, who have decided to copy the turquoise table. Let's watch the little clip.
I always thought I'd go far away on mission. I really did. I really thought my calling would be international, and I never in a million years thought that the Lord would ask me to walk outside of my door and get to know my neighbors. I'm Kristen Schell, and I live in Austin, Texas. I am a wife and a mother of 4 children.
Sleepy morning.
Any given day, I am in the kitchen or in the minivan. I am active in the kids' school. I'm a writer, and I volunteer at church. We've been in this neighborhood almost 10 years. I always knew we were supposed to love our neighbors because that's the great commandment. But how you live that out day to day is hard, especially when you don't know your neighbors, which is the situation I was in. I did not know my neighbors. Sure, I knew, a handful of them. And so there was this huge question, what do you want me to do, Lord? Here I am, Lord. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to walk across the street and bang on doors? Do you want me to take cookies? What do you want me to do, Lord? God answers prayers in really winsome ways. I was hosting a party with a friend in our backyard, and I didn't have any tables. And so I ordered a picnic table from Lowe's. And when it arrived 2 days later, I knew that for the purposes of the party, I was going to have it in my backyard. But as soon as that party was over, I was moving that table in the front yard, and it was going to be a gathering place. And so I painted it turquoise, which is my favorite color. And I did. I put it outside underneath a tree in the front yard. It was awkward at first. So I have this table, it's bright turquoise, it's sitting in the front yard, and now I'm like, well, now what do I do? So I took a whole bunch of stuff out with me. I took my phone and my journal and my computer, and I even I had some art stuff that I was working on because, I needed to look like I was just doing something. By going out front, I was saying to God, here I am, Lord, your will be done. Go before, behind, and beside me into the neighborhood. And that very day, life changed, and I met a neighbor within 3 hours of putting a table out in my front yard. A lot has happened since putting the table out there. There are a handful of women who are now very close friends who I did not know. It has become kind of a gathering place.
I'm Bob. This is my daughter, Peggy.
So one of the best things is just the sense of normal community, everyday life. The neighborhood kids come over. They'll do homework when the weather's pretty. We've had lemonade stands, hot cocoa stands. More intimately, It's a place where I can meet and have met neighbors who now pop by with coffee and just for 15 minutes, a conversation over coffee that wouldn't have happened. The Lord has taught me, and I am learning to be present. It sounds like it should be a no-brainer, but listening is not a skill that came naturally at first to me, nor was being present.
This was really fun. It was great to see you here.
Loving my neighbors has taught me how to love God better. It's drawn me into deeper relationship with Him. You don't need permission or a program to go outside and be who Christ has called you to be. When we open up our front door and we take 3 steps right out our front yard, good things happen. Open up your door and let God do the rest.
Nobody is going to do anything complicated, I guess. It's going to be hard to persuade anyone, but if we do something simple, and what can be more simple than putting a table on the front lawn? Nothing can be surely more simple. And I realized when I watched that show, it's not only about neighbors, there's something about a table. And there is something in our faith that revolves around tables. And I'm sure the next slide will bring up a table which is familiar to you. It doesn't look exactly like ours, but if you want to look at that one over there, there's a visual aid for you. A lot of that slide is a dinner church that I attended 2 years ago in October 2019 when I went to study. The Presbyterian Church allowed me to study some models in the States, and that's in Kansas City. It's a very simple thing. On a particular evening during the week, it's dinner church. Members of the congregation where it meets are only there if they are serving and working. The other people sitting around the table are all people who don't come to church, who are not really interested in what we call pews and pulpit church. They come, they share a meal together. It's a simple meal. The church provides some of it. Many people add to it. And so a long table is stretched on the right-hand side of the picture, and then you sit around tables. Now, at my table, I'm taking this from my table because I didn't want to stand up and take a photo. I was too embarrassed. But I'm sitting at the table taking a picture. At my table, on that side, was sitting a lady, and when I asked her who she was and what she did, she told me she was a medical doctor, and she lived in town, but she loved this meeting once a week. And the other gentleman over there also, some sort of a professional person. Opposite were 2 homeless people sitting there. And I thought, when last have I ever seen a homeless person in a church? Certainly not this church. And so we went around the table. It was so cosmopolitan. And all of a sudden, during the service, they asked if so-and-so was there. And one of the homeless people stood up and they said it's her birthday. And they brought a cake and they had candles. And it was beautiful. And the lady, when she brought it back to the table, she said, I knew I had to come tonight because it was my birthday and I knew they would remember. And I thought, this is what church is for her and for the others sitting there. And it was totally multi-everything. It was beautiful. The next slide. We focus on a table. That table, the table of Holy Communion, but it's also a table that is based on very simple stories. That table began as this table. It was a dinner table. It was far simpler than that. But you know the stories, the Last Supper. You know the story about Peter and being reinstated on the beach with a fish bride with the disciples. You know the story of the 2 who walked from Jerusalem to Emmaus on the afternoon after Easter, and they saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread. You know Jesus at the house of Simon the Pharisee and the woman who came and anointed his feet. All these tables and meals. The wedding in Cana of Galilee was a magnificent feast. And of course, when Jesus has to describe, and when others, like Paul, have to describe what heaven is like, they talk about a great banquet. Tables, tables, tables. Always together, eating together. There's something about this image. And perhaps this is the something that we need to spur us on to share our faith with others. How can we use a table or many tables to befriend the people of this neighborhood? How can we be a good neighbor to those around us? The last little clip I want to show you, again, is one that I've played before. By the way, this was the sign on that dinner church, and I thought it was so good, and if it wasn't used there, I would have stolen it. Just go back to that sign, Anthony. Everyone's welcome. Nobody's perfect. Anything can happen. That's what the sign was for that church service. Everyone's welcome. Nobody's perfect. Anything can happen. And then, of course, you know Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper there. It's all about the table. Let me play this little clip for you, and that'll be the start of the end of this Vision Night address.
One of the things I love the most about St. Lydia's is that it's a thing still in the process of becoming, and that's part of its identity.
Our central act at St. Lydia's is to gather together around a meal and around a table. The idea is that when we're at this table together, there's a way in which we're practicing for how we'd like to be when we're out in the world. So it's a table where we learn how to feed one another and where we learn how to be fed. It's a table where we learn to be compassionate with one another and patient with one another. And it's a table where we learn to be open to God's presence and to spend time sort of feeling that movement and that presence in our lives.
We start our worship by gathering around a central candle and singing a lamp-lighting hymn. And we all light our own candles from that one central candle and pass the fire from one person to the next. And then as we sing, we process to the tables and light all the candles on the tables. And by doing that, we all get to participate in marking this space as sacred.
So there's a story in the book of Luke that's about Jesus after the resurrection meeting two disciples on the road, and they don't recognize him. And what happens is that they come together for dinner, and when they sit down at the table, Jesus breaks bread. And it says that he was known to them in the breaking of the bread, that in the moment that the bread broke, the disciples recognized Christ. This is my body.
This is my body.
Amen. And that's really the story that's at the heart of everything that we do together, that when we gather together at this table and when we break bread and share it, there's a sense that Christ is in our midst. And not only is Christ there with us at the table, but he's also present in each of us so that we can be Christ to one another.
Earlier in my life, I had an idea that going to church meant making certain proclamations and adhering to certain theories. But being at St. Lydia's and sitting down every week next to strangers, I found that in that moment, when I pass the bread and the bread is passed to me, that God is present and I feel connected to something bigger than myself.
And Jesus stands on the shore of the gray morning in the dawn, the same hour that he appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden. Dawn, when the night is not quite over, but the day has not quite begun. He appears, inhabiting this in-between time when darkness and light are intermingled. His question to the disciples breaks my heart. "Children, you have no fish, have you?" And they answer him, "No, we have been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything." When the catch comes in, it is more than they could have ever dreamed of, more than they could ever consume. And still, we are told, the net does not tear.
I think St. Lydia's appeals to people who maybe live far away from family, and either emotionally or geographically, and crave a home-cooked meal in the company of people who will accept them for who they are, no matter what they are.
So we finish our worship by everyone in the congregation helping to clean up all the food and the dishes and all the big mess that we've made. And that's one of my favorite moments in the service because I think there's a way in which you can kind of see the community that's been formed over the course of the evening, that when we came together at the beginning of the night, we were strangers to one another, and by the end of the night, we're friends.
I think that there's a big emphasis in our culture on the finished product, but I've realized that I learned something from the process of making something, and that's really where the value is for me in being an artist. And I think that's true at St. Lydia's as well. By making church together every week, we learn about ourselves, and it doesn't really matter if the singing sounds perfect or if the food tastes perfect, or, you know, it really matters that we did it and that we wrestled with it for a while together.
Holy food for holy people. Share in the meal.
St. Lydia's Anglican Church in New York City is not a restaurant. There are no waiters or cooks, but it taps into a neighborhood where so many single people have come to work way far from where their families are. And so several times a week, a congregation of previously unchurched people will come, and they will prepare a meal together, and they will sit down and eat that meal in a sacramental manner, passing the bread, passing the wine, just as Jesus did. A short and simple message will be shared, conversation would be had around the table, and then at the end they wash up together and clean up everything and put it all away, and the congregation meets again next week. They had to limit the numbers. It was overflowing. And anyway, that's a particular story from a particular neighborhood. Who knows what kinds of tables it will take for those of us sitting here and online to share our faith with others. Let me finish. Firstly, what has COVID taught us? Well, COVID taught us many things, but two things to be mentioned. One, we can change. We have not been the same for 2,000 years. We thought we were. We lived under that illusion. It's not the truth. But we can change. And even when the regular diet of worship is interrupted by a pandemic, we can feel those hidden bonds of love that connect us together. It's harder. Maybe some would say it's second prize, but we can be church even in those dire circumstances. And secondly, church works best when lay people and ministers work together, where lay people are not the audience, ministers are not the show, pretty poor show anyway. But when we work together, because of course we had no idea, Bevan and I, how to make a video clip. We had no idea how to send it out, or YouTube and all these Zoom and all these words that, well, we sometimes struggle to work out the meaning of them even now. But the fact is, when your expertise is put together with our expertise, something wonderful can happen, not only for us, but also for those far afield with whom we share the gospel through passing on these links. And it's not only the expertise, it's the love, it's the support, it's the encouragement. I can't tell you how many times during the deepest, darkest lockdowns, I bumped into somebody in a shop or something, and they said these words, "Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. We know it's hard for you," and you in the plural, "but you are keeping us connected." And then you feel like $1 million. And you think it's worthwhile, and I'm going to make it better next week. We can work harder, and we can do other things. We can put puddings and soups and Lord knows what others. Because that person said, "I noticed, and it's appreciated, and thank you." And that we're eternally grateful for.